Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. Today we're really diving into something that's been on a lot of people's minds, and that's this whole concept of a polycrisis.
Oh, yeah, I've heard that term floating around.
Yeah, and it sounds kind of complicated, but it's actually a pretty straightforward idea.
Right.
It's basically like saying the world is dealing with like a bunch of serious problems all at the same time.
Like we didn't already know that, right?
Haha. Yeah, well, it's more about how these problems are all kind of interconnected. It's not just like separate issues. It's more like they're all feeding into each other and making things even more messy.
I see.
And to unpack all of this, we're going to be using a New Year's greeting letter as like our starting point.
A New Year's greeting. That's an interesting choice.
It is, right? It's from a teacher named Zhu, and he raises this really thought-provoking question.
Okay, I'm listening.
He's asking, like, in a world that feels like it's, maybe going a little bit crazy, how do we still find hope and meaning?
That's a big question for sure.
It is right. And to try to answer it, we're going to be looking at some pretty diverse sources.
Like what?
We've got, economic reports and historical anecdotes, even a book review.
Wow. Oh, quite a mix.
Yeah, it's going to be a fun ride. So buckle up.
All right, I'm ready.
Okay, so Zhu starts off by talking about this idea of a polycrisis. And he quotes Larry Summers. You might have heard of him.
Oh, yeah, former U.S. Treasury Secretary, right?
That's the one. And Summers basically says the world is facing the most complex set of challenges he's seen in like 40 years.
Wow. That's a pretty long time.
Yeah, and then Zhu brings in Nouriel Roubini, who's sometimes called Dr. Doom.
Oh, yeah, I know him. He's always predicting the worst.
Exactly, and he actually lays out 10 major threats. He calls them mega threats.
Okay, now that sounds serious.
It does, doesn't it? He talks about things like, unsustainable debt levels and rising political tensions between superpowers.
Oh, yeah, those are definitely things to worry about.
And trade wars and, of course, climate change.
Right, climate change is always at the top of the list.
Yeah, it is these days. But what's really fascinating is how Zhu connects these, like, modern anxieties with something really ancient.
Ancient, what do you mean?
He brings up a 5,000-year-old Assyrian tablet inscription.
Wow, 5,000 years ago. That's hard to even imagine.
I know, right? And this inscription, it's basically like an ancient rant about how the world is falling apart.
People were complaining about the same things back then.
Totally. It's like kids are disrespectful. Everyone's writing doom and gloom prophecies. It's crazy how much it sounds like what we hear today.
Uh-huh. So we haven't really come that far, have we?
Maybe not, haha, but, even though this stuff has been going on for centuries, it does feel different now, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think there's something about the scale and the speed of change that feels new.
Exactly. And Zhu even brings it down to a personal level, to show how this actually affects us.
How so?
He mentions the price of eggs.
Eggs? Really?
Yeah, like how they've gotten so expensive.
Oh, yeah, I've noticed that at the grocery store.
It's a great example of how these global mega threats, as Roubini calls them, they actually hit home.
It's like suddenly it's not just some abstract thing. It's your breakfast costing more.
Exactly. And speaking of real-world consequences, Zhu also brings up this geopolitical strategist named Peter Zeihan.
Okay, I don't think I know him.
He wrote a book called The End of the World is Just the Beginning.
Wow, that's a pretty dramatic title.
It is, and he makes some pretty startling predictions.
Like what?
He argues that we're heading towards global food shortages, and that could lead to mass starvation, social unrest, even the collapse of governments.
Wow, that's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is. It's definitely heavy stuff. But what I found interesting is how he connects all these different trends.
In what way?
He's saying that, geopolitical shifts, population changes the way we produce food. It's all intertwined.
Okay, I can see how that could be a problem.
And, reading all of this, it can be pretty overwhelming. Like you're constantly switching between worrying about paying the bills and wondering if civilization is about to collapse.
Yeah, I can definitely relate to that feeling.
It's a lot to process, right?
It is. But you know what I think is important to remember is that Zhu isn't just presenting like a doom and gloom scenario.
What do you mean?
He's also offering like a potential path forward. A way to find hope amidst all this chaos.
Okay, so there's light at the end of the tunnel.
Maybe we should say a glimmer of light, at least.
Really, a glimmer. And that brings us to a really unexpected source, a novel by Flannery O'Connor called A Good Man is Hard to Find.
Flannery O'Connor, huh? I haven't read her in a while.
Her writing is really something else,
Yeah, it's definitely not light reading.
No, it's pretty intense. But that's kind of the point. The story is about this family on a road trip, and they run into a group of escaped convicts.
Oh, no, that doesn't sound good.
It isn't. The leader of the convicts is this really chilling character called the Misfit.
Okay, I'm getting chills just thinking about it.
Right. It's like this clash between the grandmother's traditional faith and the kidnapper's totally nihilistic worldview.
Wow, so it's about, like, good versus evil.
Kind of, but it's more nuanced than that, you know? And what's cool is that Zoo includes these contrasting book reviews.
Book reviews, why?
It adds another layer to the whole thing. One reviewer is like praising the novel for its deeper themes, while another one just calls it straight up mental garbage.
Whoa, strong reaction.
Right, but I think those reactions kind of mirror how people are responding to the Polycrisis itself, you know?
How so?
Some people see it as like a wake-up call, an opportunity for change, while others just dismiss it as fear-mongering.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it makes you wonder, why do people react so differently to these big existential questions?
That's a really interesting question.
Right.
And it probably has to do with how we each, like, process complex information. You know, some people are more comfortable with uncertainty than others.
That makes sense. And ultimately, Zhu uses this novel to ask two really fundamental questions.
What are they?
First, he asks, what is true hope worth waiting for?
That's a deep one.
It is. And then he asks, how do we actually attain that kind of hope?
So he's not just identifying the problem, he's actually trying to find solutions.
Exactly. And that leads him to his next source, a passage from the Bible.
The Bible. Okay, now this is getting interesting.
It's from 1 Peter 1.3 to 9, and it's all about finding living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
So he's bringing in a religious perspective.
He is. He even shares the passage in his letter.
What does it say?
Let me see. It says, "Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. According to his great mercy, he has caused us to be born again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead, to an inheritance that is imperishable, undefiled, and unfading, kept in heaven for you."
Wow, that's pretty powerful language.
It is. It really speaks to this longing for something beyond, our immediate circumstances.
Yeah, like a sense of hope that goes beyond just the material world.
Exactly. And I think that's what Zhu is getting at.
I see. So even though the world might feel like it's falling apart, there's still this possibility of finding hope in something bigger than ourselves.
Right. And that's really the heart of what we're going to be exploring today.
This is going to be a fascinating deep dive.
It is. It's going to challenge us to think about how we view the world and what gives our lives meaning, even when things are tough.
I'm ready for the challenge.
Me too. Let's dive in. It's almost like a contradiction, isn't it? On the one hand, we've got these experts talking about all these global threats, and then we have Zhu pointing to faith as a source of hope.
I think that tension is exactly what Zhu is trying to highlight.
Yeah, mean?
It's like he's not trying to sugarcoat things, right? He's acknowledging the reality of the polycrisis, but at the same time, he's saying we don't have to let it crush us.
So it's not about ignoring the problems, but finding a way to deal with them without losing hope.
Exactly. And I think that's where faith comes in. It's about having something to hold on to, something that gives you strength when things get tough.
Okay, I can see that.
Right.
But how do we actually do that? It's one thing to read about faith, but how do we put it into practice, in our everyday lives?
That's a great question. And I don't think Zhu is pretending it's easy. He's not offering some magic solution or a quick fix.
So what is he saying?
I think he's inviting us to really think about what we believe in. What are our core values? What gives our lives meaning, even when the world feels uncertain?
It's like asking ourselves what really matters in the grand scheme of things, right?
Right. And I think that's where faith can play a role. It's not just about believing in something. It's about letting that belief guide our actions and decisions.
So it's about more than just words. It's about actually living out our faith.
Exactly. And that can look different for different people. It's not about following a set of rules. It's about finding what resonates with you personally.
I'm curious about that image he uses, the tree of life. He talks about how our anxieties come from being separated from that tree.
It's a powerful metaphor, isn't it?
It is.
What do you think it means?
Well, I think he's saying that we're all longing for something more. Something that connects us to something bigger than ourselves, like a sense of belonging or purpose.
Exactly. And he's suggesting that the resurrection of Jesus offers a way to restore that connection, to overcome that feeling of separation.
So even though the world might be full of problems, we don't have to feel lost and alone.
Right. There's a way to find our way back to that tree of life, so to speak.
That's a really comforting thought, I have to admit.
It is. And I think it's important to remember that this isn't just about escaping our problems. It's not about pretending everything is okay.
So what is it about then?
It's about finding a source of strength and hope that allows us to face the challenges head on, but with courage and resilience.
I see. So it's not about denial, it's about finding a way to live in the midst of the mess without being consumed by it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that's a really powerful message.
It is. But how do we actually do that? Like, how do we cultivate that kind of faith and courage, especially when things are so uncertain?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It
Yeah.
is. And I don't know if there's an easy answer.
No, I don't think there is. But maybe it starts with asking ourselves some tough questions. Like, is faith really at the center of our lives? Does it inform our decisions, our relationships, the way we interact with the world?
So it's about taking a step back and really examining our priorities.
Right. And I think that's a journey we all have to take on our own terms. There's no one-size-fits-all approach.
That makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
I guess it's like Zoo is challenging us to figure out what truly matters to us and then to live accordingly.
Exactly. And I think that's a challenge worth taking on.
It is. But I have to be honest, I'm still struggling with this idea that faith can somehow transform the polycrisis. Like, does that mean the problems just go away? That doesn't seem very realistic.
I understand your skepticism.
Yeah.
And I don't think Zhu is saying that faith will magically make all the problems disappear.
Yeah, I mean, it just feels a bit too simple. Like faith is the answer to everything.
No, I don't think he's saying that at all. It's more about, how our faith shapes our response to these challenges.
So, like, how we approach the problems, not that the problems themselves disappear.
Exactly. It's about recognizing that even though things might look really bad right now, there's still a source of hope and strength that we can tap into.
Okay, but what does that look like practically? How do we actually do that?
I think it starts with recognizing that our faith isn't just something we think about on Sundays.
Hmm.
It should be something that informs every aspect of our lives.
So, like our decisions, our relationships, how we treat other people.
Exactly. It's about aligning our actions with our values. Walking the walk, not just talking the talk.
That's easier said than done, though, isn't it?
Oh, absolutely. It takes effort. It takes commitment.
Yeah.
But I think it's worth it, because ultimately it's about finding a way to live with a sense of purpose, even when the world feels like it's falling apart.
It makes you wonder, though, like, can our individual actions really make a difference when we're talking about these massive global problems?
That's a valid question. And I think it's easy to feel powerless, when you're facing something as big as a polycrisis. But I also believe that every act of kindness, every attempt to make the world a better place does matter.
So it's not about solving all the problems single-handedly, but about doing what we can to make a positive impact.
Right. It's about recognizing that even small actions can ripple outwards and create change.
And that even in the darkest of times, there's still a possibility of hope.
Exactly. That's what Zhu is trying to tell us. He's not denying the reality of the polycrisis, but he's also reminding us that we have the power to choose hope, to choose love, to choose to make a difference.
That's a really powerful message, and I think it's something we all need to hear, especially right now.
I agree. It's a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming challenges, we're not powerless. We can choose to be agents of hope, agents of change.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into Zhu's letter and this whole idea of a polycrisis, I think we're left with a really important question.
And what's that?
Can a deep transformative faith actually help us navigate these challenges and maybe even find a way to thrive in the midst of them?
It's a question worth pondering, for sure, and one that might lead us to a more meaningful and hopeful way of living in the world.
Well said.
Mm.
And on that note, we'd like to thank you for joining us on the deep dive. We hope this conversation has given you some food for thought and maybe even a renewed sense of hope for the future. Until next time, stay curious and keep exploring.